So the African book for January was The Sleepless by Nuzo Onoh. First of all, I will start off by saying I am not a horror person. This is a horror book and I do not like horror. I am a big old scaredy cat. I don't like gore. I feel lightheaded and weak and my hands go numb whenever I think about or see surgery. And that's like opening someone up with the intent to heal them. So yeah, I'm not a big horror person, but I read this book. But I've noticed that I do tend to like horror if it's not set in North America for some reason. I enjoyed The Watcher and the Creeper, and those two are set in Ireland, and I enjoyed this. And this is set in Nigeria. Just the first chapter of this book dredged up some of my old fears and anxieties from my late teens, young adult years. There was what seemed to be like a spree of Muti killings, if you remember, around that era, and I was petrified. Terrified. If you want to know more, you can find like forensics articles as well as like newspaper articles. To be fair though, back then I did live in a constant state of anxiety, but now that anxiety has transformed itself into just like a general mistrust of everyone and everything, which is functionally the same thing, but the latter is less taxing on my health. Anyway, all that to say, witch doctors are scary. They are. I'm sorry. It was nice to see that validated in this book. They're just scary. I'm sorry. Even the ones who don't traffic in human body parts or don't regularly terrorize people with albinism. The Sleepless is a horror or a paranormal horror. I think that goes without saying. I don't know. I don't know anything about this genre. I'm sorry. And this is told from the perspective of a 6, 7, 8-year-old girl, Odele. And don't read the synopsis of this book if you're in any way interested in it, because this does not really have what I would deem is a traditional plot. It's just a good story. But the synopsis says too much. I think it gives away way too much of what happens in the story. And I enjoyed just like, being surprised by things happening. So yeah, it is just a good story. But I do think about it in 3 parts. And also, by a good story, I mean a horrific story. Just truly horrific. Any horrible, terrible thing you can imagine happening to a child happens to a child in this book. And a lot of it is on page. And I think this is the reason why I enjoy this, despite not being like a horror person, despite being a big old scaredy cat. It wasn't gratuitous. The things that do happen on page are presented in such a matter-of-fact way. They're not like exploitative at all. I did not get the sense that this author was getting off on the violence, which is how I usually feel in my, rare forays into horror, whether it's film or television. It does feel like they're getting off to it, especially if it's sexual violence against a woman. Anyway, I did not feel any of that in here. So the story is about poor little Odele, who's just trying to survive her childhood. Her household wasn't perfect before, but it is now in turmoil because her younger brother has recently gone missing. She is now effectively that the younger brother is missing, the youngest of 1, 2, 3, 4. But her older sister loves her to death, and her older sister is kind of her only support and friend and source of love and affection. Now the 3 parts, and I'm going to talk about what jumped out to me thematically, and also in talking about the 3 parts, I'll be explaining why I loved this book so much. And the reason is mostly because it validated a lot of my fears. It hit on and validated a lot of personal fears that I have. Part 1 is vulnerability, aka the horrors of being a child. God, it is just crazy to me like how vulnerable children are. When you are born, you are completely and utterly at the mercy of whoever decided to make you. And it's like a roll, and it's a roll of the dice whether or not those people are decent, at the very least decent or not. And that is insane. That is so scary and horrifying, that level of vulnerability. This vulnerability is illustrated so perfectly, so clearly in part 1 of the book. And you know what? My own personal opinion, I think the nuclear family has made this worse. And like, I hated being a child so much, and I had pretty cool parents, most of the time. I was so acutely aware of just how vulnerable I was as a child, and just like grateful for how lucky I was. Everything is confusing, and adults barely explain things to you, especially if it's like difficult subject matter. Like, they'll just mention something and expect you to know. You have very little, if any, autonomy, and your only self-defense, your only weapons, I guess, are like cuteness, if you're lucky, and a fawning response, which is like, oh my god, so counterintuitive sometimes. Again, if your parents are sociopaths, they're never gonna love you, and you don't know that, but it's all you've got. Horrifying. Horrifying. So Odella in part one, she has like good days and bad days. The bad days are very bad and the good days are fun. Like being a child can be fun sometimes, but when the bad days come and she just finds herself so ill-equipped because she's a child to deal with, all of the horrific things that happen in this book, and also impossible like moral conundrums about things that she barely understands, again because nobody explains things to children. It just drives it home. The first part was basically the fallout of the brother's disappearance and the impact on Odella's life. There are paranormal elements sprinkled in throughout, mythological and paranormal elements. So part one sets the stage. It got me thinking about vulnerability. And then part two happens. And part two is about the horrors of existing in the world. In part one, you understand the horror of true vulnerability. And then part two shows you that, hey, that vulnerability never ends. It does not go away. Like, sure, you have more autonomy now. You can decide when you go to bed or whether or not you want to have cereal for supper or not, sure. But no matter where you live in the world, you are at the mercy of the suits. The suits can wake up one day and decide, hey, guess what? We're at war. One minute you're just living your ordinary, normal, everyday life. The next minute now you're apparently at war. Now you have to pack up essentials and now you have to leave your home, which is going to get bombed. Now you're a refugee. If you're lucky, maybe you can stay in the same country, maybe go to another province. Or if you're very unlucky, now you're at the mercy of another state that barely tolerates you. They'll blame you for all of their problems. It's those damn refugees. You and your children are being raped by your own or the enemy soldiers or peacekeepers. Horrifying, traumatizing things are happening. And all you did was lose a dice roll at birth. You should have just been born somewhere else. So this book begins with an author's note, which I usually skip, but for some reason I read this. And Nuzo, the author, talks about the Nigerian Biafran War that took place in the late 50s and lasted 3 years. Apparently around 2 million civilians died during this war, this conflict, and I had never heard anything about this in my entire life. This was the first time I've ever heard anything about this at all, but that's how it is. There are too many horrible things happening all the time everywhere to keep up with, unfortunately. And some people's trauma and the worst months, days, years of people's lives get relegated to footnotes. Anyway, Nuzo herself, the author, she lived through this conflict. She was a child at the time, and she recounts the story of standing still and pretending to be trees to evade air raids. And this is something that happens to Odella in the book as well. Other horrific wartime things happen in this book that happen in real life, specifically just a lot of rape. Whenever there's war, there's just a lot of rape of women and children. And it's just hard not to feel like half of the human population is made up of animals when they just go absolutely feral anytime the opportunity presents itself. Odella's life in part two is very different, but kind of the same. We see this war through the perspective of a child. And so the reasons for the conflict and the war, they never quite make sense. Again, nobody explains things to children. But even as an adult, it doesn't make sense. It never makes sense. All the wars currently happening everywhere constantly, they never make sense. Never. They all seem senseless. But the whole point of this rambling, and the thing that gave me just a visceral, terrified reaction, was the fact that the adults in this book are just as vulnerable, just as powerless as the child. It never ends. And then part three didn't necessarily have like a big theme that jumped out at me. It was basically wrapping up the story parts. But I want to talk about the other scary thing that is a motif throughout the book, and that is religion, superstition, or belief. This circles back around to the beginning of this video where I mentioned how scary witch doctors are. But it's not just the old religions that are scary. The old religions that are, by the way, perverted by the Abrahamic religions. Nuzo also shows just how scary those that wield the Abrahamic religions are as well. She also goes out of her way to show good for both the old religions and the Abrahamic ones. There's a character called Brother Pastor. We never actually see him. Odella never actually interacts with him on page, but she thinks about him and his teachings often. And he's trying. He's trying in his own way to help these kids. And then there are the aid workers during the war who come from a church, an overseas church. They're not like your classic missionaries. They're like actually helping with aid and stuff. And with the old religions, we have the Sleepless themselves and everything that surrounds that. I'm being very vague because read the book. Read it. It's good. It's a great book. Seeing all of these religions and beliefs and superstitions from the perspective of a child just goes to show like how contradictory and nonsensical they are. It also shows just how traumatizing religion can be for children because they take everything literally, they believe everything. And also, there's just nothing scary to me than being at the mercy of one or a group of people with irrational beliefs in a feedback loop with each other and you. Anything you do, you have a demon inside of you. If you're thrashing about trying to get out of restraints, look, it's the demon. The demon is trying to leave the body. Or if you're sitting there calmly or shocked, look, it's the demon. The demon is not even scared. This is a powerful demon. Do you know what I mean? Oh my God, scary, scary. And also people who are emboldened to do whatever it is they want to do with you by their beliefs. Inter-deity here wants me to do this. Horrifying. I said that this was like a paranormal mythological horror. Those things tend to not scare me, but the scenes were scary. Another thing I loved was the writing. I like the style of writing. The simplicity especially works, for the perspective we were given. And also the matter of factness made some of the more horrific things easier to digest for me, and it didn't like horrify me. Like we were not reveling in the violence, we were describing it. Another thing I loved is that there were truly like lighthearted, funny moments in this book that made me like actually like audibly laugh. Yes, there are jokes in this horrific book. The pacing in this book, masterclass. Scenes never overstay their welcome, and the tension is built up to and then held and then released masterfully. Like just that's why I read this so quickly. Nuzo wrote such a convincing child. It's amazing. Like it took me back to my own childhood, but not the horrific things. Again, I had a good childhood. I had a good childhood. But just like the whole, growing up African stuff, even though this is like decades removed and also, across the continent, but like there's just some things that apparently are universal, that are just like continental and atemporal, I guess. I absolutely hated how some things ended for some of the characters. Hated it. I needed more people to die horrifically. 10 out of 10. Read this book so you can understand what I was talking about in this video, because I was being so vague.